Every villain has his day. All right, it's Sunday, which means Doctor Who, and it also means that it's time for me to get to Big Finish, and these are voted on by my Patreon supporters, which one I'm going to do next, and they have selected that I cover Davros, and this is the story featuring the Sixth Doctor, Colin Baker. This kind of rounds out what is sort of a thematic trilogy, if not a narrative trilogy, of villain-centric stories, because I had done previously Master and Omega, and Master featured the Seventh Doctor, Omega featured the Fifth Doctor. So now I get to cover Davros. Now, Davros as a character is, I like him in a lot of ways, at least as far as his time on the show goes. I find him a little overloved at times. I like him and he works, especially for his part, in the creation of the Daleks, but I kind of resent the character a little bit for, at least in the classic era, kind of taking over the Dalek stories. After he was introduced in Genesis of the Daleks, it was really rare to have a Dalek story that was not also a Davros story. So he kind of co-opted their entire narrative, which I never really appreciated, because while I like him as a character, I would have been really interested to see what was going on with the Daleks separate from him, especially considering that he wasn't really their leader. He didn't really have control over them, which was an interesting dynamic, but that always kind of bugged me. And also, comparatively, we've, at least in the show, we've gotten very little time with Davros separate from the Daleks. Now, he still has good moments. He has good highlights. I do actually really love the stuff with him in The Witch is Familiar, and I think Julian Beach plays him really well in Modern Era. But here we have Terry Malloy playing him from Classic Era Davros. And so this is... This is more in line with the classic stuff, and nicely, it is separate from the Daleks. So he's not co-opting a Dalek story, and he's not shackled with the Daleks. So, basic plot overview and synopsis. I'll try and avoid spoilers, because I know not as many people listen to the audios as watch the show, so I can't count on most of my audience already knowing this thing. So, plot-wise, the way it goes is Davros, and this has kind of already been established in the show by this point, because Davros actually dies at the very end of his first appearance and then keeps coming back. And it gets established and sort of firmed up here that the life support functions of his chair, that he uses to get around because he's severely disfigured and disabled, it's got really phenomenal life support system. So as long as he's in that chair, he's almost impossible to kill. So his body is stolen by this head of a galactic level company. And I don't think they actually say a year this takes place in, but it's sort of your generic unspecified future where human society, because they are explicitly called out as humans, it's not an alien society. Human society is run by a handful of corporations. It's effectively implied that there isn't really government anymore, and that capitalism is such that the corporations are just running everything at this point. And you get your usual sort of dystopia elements associated with that, as one would expect with that kind of setup. But the head of one of these corporations and his wife, they steal what they think is Davros's body. So they kind of get a bit of a bonus when he comes around, and they're able to revive him. Now, they're interested in him for different reasons. The company owner sees him as a general asset, especially once he's awake, because then he's like, I can use this man's mind because he was a brilliant scientist, and I can develop new tactics, new ways of coming at things, new products, new ways to increase efficiency, all this stuff. And then there's his wife, who is a historian and has had a very heavy interest in the Daleks and Davros. So she sort of has that I was going to say academic, but it's more than academic with her. She has a very keen, specific interest in Davros. And so there's that. Now, the Doctor gets brought into this fairly coincidentally, which, you know, it happens sometimes. So he gets brought in by a journalist who is trying to uncover stuff about this corporation. And the Doctor initially just doesn't want to get involved because he doesn't, like, this is just the capitalist system. And, you know, the big threat that what the journalist is trying to uncover is something that will lead to a whole bunch of people losing their jobs and mines getting shut down. And the Doctor doesn't not care, but that's real small potatoes by his usual scale of stepping in to intervene. So he's a bit reluctant, but he's kind of, okay. But then he sees Davros is around. He's like, whoa, hold on. And obviously that completely changes the game. And throughout this, we get flashback sequences of Davros before he was disfigured and put in the debilitated state we are used to seeing him with. So we get flashbacks to his time with the Khaled people, in their war with the Thals, as he attempts to, work on things to help them win the war. He has a relationship with a woman that becomes end up being a big part of that. I don't want to go too much more into the plot specifically beyond that. What I will say is this story attempts to do something that I think is really dangerous. And I mean that mostly narratively, but also a little bit not just that, with how things have been going lately in the world. And what I mean by that is it takes us, to a certain degree, it humanizes Davros more than we've gotten in the past. And there's a couple of reasons that that's kind of a dangerous thing to do. The first is that, narratively, you can end up defanging, a villain. I think a humanized villain can be a great villain, but especially a villain that you've had long running, starting to humanize them more and give more of a reason for people to have sympathy with them can very easily make them less effective as a villain, or make writers less willing to use them at the same level of villainy. So I was worried about that. And then in regards to Davros specifically, given the links of the Daleks and the fact that Terry Nation created them to very explicitly be a parallel to the Nazis, and the fact that Davros himself he's a little bit of a Mengele figure, to humanize someone like that can be really distasteful to do. But thankfully it threads the needle really expertly, because we get little glimpses of basically how Davros's mind works, because his whole mental process, his way of approaching and looking at things, he has to have, when he's revived, he's looking at, these machines and these things, and he's understanding most of the technology, or at least the theory behind it, almost immediately, because he's that smart. But there's core, basic, fundamental concepts that he just can't, he has trouble wrapping his head around, and he needs laid out for him. Things like the nature of a capitalistic society, to be honest, the idea of developing things for profit, whereas he lived his entire life. The Khals and the Thals were at war from before he was born, so he lived his entire life, and he was raised in a military mindset, in a what is most effective for our side to help defeat the other side. His entire thought process is a we are at war thought process, and that gets illustrated really well across this. And in regards to what I said about the danger of kind of basically humanizing a monster, especially one that is partially inspired by real life monsters, this actually manages to kind of highlight why that's a problem with with the wife figure, who, like I said, kind of idolizes him to a certain degree, because it's never explicitly stated as such, which is nice because it respects the intelligence of the audience, but she is painted a little bit as a Dalek apologist, a bit like a modern era Nazi apologist would. The people who say, okay, look, yes, they did bad things, but let's focus on, all the good things. And not that, it's necessarily a good thing to paint, anybody, group, or anything with they're always evil, that's the end of the conversation brush. But at the same time, to focus exclusively on what you think are the positives, you can see she has come to idolize a monster, like a true monster that she sees as a great man, and it's kind of unnerving, and it's depicted as unnerving, which again, I think was a real good way for them to basically address the potential elephant in the room and diffuse what could have been a very uncomfortable situation as far as what the story is doing. And in regards to the revelations we get about Davros, everything lines up really well. So we get little humanizing moments, but then as we get more of his backstory and more of his thought process and what he's after, it all lines up. So it's not like, we're not seeing the human behind the monster, that we had been seeing before. We are seeing the human components that exist in what is still undeniably a monster. And it also deals nicely with whether or not Davros is capable of changing. And I would consider this a spoiler, but I mean, Davros comes back in other stories, so we know this isn't it for him. But yeah, ultimately he can't. But what I like about this is it doesn't do what the lazy thing would have been. The lazy thing would have been that he's presenting a facade to, this corporate head and his wife, and going, acting as if he's going to change while planning and scheming behind the scenes. And that's not really what goes on. He does try to put his mind to the problems that are presented to him. Problems of overpopulation, of insufficient resources. He does try to put his mind towards solving things that were never a problem on Skaro. They didn't have an overpopulation problem. People died really young in the war. So, these are things he's never had to deal with, and he does try to put his mind to solving these things, but just because of the way he's wired, and I don't mean that like in a mental illness way, I mean because of just the angle and the mentality that he comes at problems, he, even wanting to, he can't change enough. He's going to fall back on what makes the most sense to him, and what makes the most sense to him is war, is destruction, is you can't make anything that's worth a darn until you tear everything else that is already here down. That's just fundamentally who he is. But I like that it wasn't a, I was scheming this the whole time, because that would have been really cheap and lazy. And it also would have reinforced, because I brought this up on the two doctors not long ago, with the doctor, seeming like, these people, they're evil. And it's a race, an alien race that we had never seen before. And that struck me as really odd. And with the Sixth Doctor saying the same thing about Davros, while it's certainly more earned with Davros, he's got personal history with the guy, he can back up what he's saying. At the same time, anytime the Doctor is making an argument of, no, they're just evil, I really need the story to handle that delicately, because that puts me, again, in a bit of discomfort, because that's not a position I like the Doctor taking. Condemning somebody forever in perpetuity, saying that there's no way that they can change. But here, because it's not true, and he was right to doubt Davros, it's more of a case of, look, Davros tried, and the Doctor was right, but not in a he will never change, but just that he can't. And so it allows the Doctor to keep his moral high ground while espousing, what he is about being fated to be awful, which Davros kind of is. So I think this was just really well put together. And as far as the performances go, Terry Malloy is awesome as Davros. He's really good, and he gets to stretch his legs a little bit in terms of the different layers and levels he's able to do. He's able to give a surprisingly nuanced performance of Davros, even, you know, the current era Davros, to say nothing of the flashbacks when he doesn't even have, you know, the modulated voice or any of the rest of it. And there's way less of the screaming Davros in this than I would, because that can grate on me, and there was not nearly as much as I was afraid there was going to be. So having this all play out the way it does. Oh, and Colin Baker's really good. I'm really coming to enjoy Sixth Doctor audio adventures, which is nice because I really have not enjoyed his stints on the show like at all. So it's really nice to know that I can come to Big Finish and go, oh, it's a Sixth Doctor story, and feel good about that as opposed to feel dread about that. So it's really nice. And there's no companion in this one. I mean, there are people helping the Doctor, but he's companion-free in this particular story. So he and Terry Malloy are very much the main focus. And all the supporting characters are fine. But it really is, this is Davros' story more than anybody else's, certainly more than the Doctor's or any of the supporting characters. And it's nicely done. I think it's probably the best done of these three villain-centric ones out of Master, Omega, Davros. I think Davros was the best one, then Master, and then Omega. Now, all three are good. None of these are bad, but that's just the order that I will put them in if I were to rank them. But all three are worth listening to. This is great stuff, and I don't know what's going to be the next Big Finish that my patrons have for me to do. We'll see. I haven't had that poll yet at time of recording. But in any case, have you heard Davros? What are your thoughts on it? If you haven't heard about it, what are your thoughts on the character in general? Whatever they are, drop something down in the comments. Let's talk about it. There's a bunch of stuff to do, and I think you know what most of it is because, you know, there's buttons and there's links and there's all sorts of stuff down there. Check it out if you like. There's the link to the Patreon. And so just remember, folks, you're the council. I just run the meetings. And until next time, this council is adjourned.